The hammer blows rang out across the valley 3 weeks before Silas Turner had worked up the nerve to say a single word to Ella Merritt, and every man in Caldwell, Kansas heard them and knew exactly what they meant. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat perched at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead on a string, dusty and loud and alive, with the kind of restless energy that came from cattle drives and whiskey and men who had nowhere better to be. The Santa Fe Railway had pushed through the year before, and with it came a flood of new settlers, new commerce, and new complications for a town that had barely figured out how to govern itself. Silas Turner had been in Caldwell for going on 4 years by then, long enough to have carved out a modest cattle operation in the foothills to the west of town, long enough to have built a solid one-room cabin with his own 2 hands, and long enough to have earned a reputation as a man who worked quietly, kept his word, and did not invite conversation unless he had something worth saying. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when it got long enough, and eyes the color of river slate. His hands were calloused from fence posts and saddle leather, and there was a scar along his left jaw from an argument with a piece of sheet metal during the winter of '76 that he never explained because no one ever asked the right way. He was not an unfriendly man. He was simply a man who had learned, through the particular education of loss and solitude, to be careful with the things he let himself want. Ella Merritt arrived in Caldwell on the 12th of April, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Wichita, with a trunk that was too heavy for one person to lift, a carpetbag in each hand, and an expression on her face that suggested she had made up her mind about something important and was not interested in being talked out of it. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned under a practical traveling hat and green eyes that had a way of taking in a room or a street or a horizon with a directness that some people found startling. She had come west from Ohio after the death of her father, a schoolteacher who had left her exactly nothing except a love of books, a talent for plain speaking, and the conviction that a woman who could read, cipher, and manage a household was an asset anywhere she chose to plant herself. She had heard that Caldwell needed a schoolteacher. She had heard correctly. The man who met her at the stage office was Fletcher Goss, chairman of the town council, a round-faced man with a broad mustache and the perpetually harried expression of someone who had promised more than he could deliver. He pumped her hand with both of his and told her that the town was very glad she had come, that school would start the following Monday, and that she would be boarding with the widow Hazel Boone on Comanche Street until permanent arrangements could be made. Ella thanked him calmly, looked at the street, looked at the prairie spreading itself out beyond the rooftops in every direction, drew a single slow breath of the warm April air, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time. She was going to be all right here. She could feel it. Silas Turner did not see Ella Merritt arrive. He was out on the south pasture that afternoon, stringing wire with his hired man, a young Cherokee fellow named Daniel Crow, who had come to work for Silas 2 summers back, and had proven himself so reliable that Silas had long since stopped thinking of him as hired help and started thinking of him as something closer to a partner in all the practical ways that mattered. It was Daniel who mentioned the new schoolteacher the next morning casually, while they were eating breakfast at the table outside the cabin in the thin, early light. "Town got its teacher," Daniel said, wrapping his hands around his coffee tin. "Woman from back east. Widow Boone is putting her up." Silas looked up from his plate. "Is that so?" "That's what Jim Harker said at the feed store yesterday afternoon when I went in for the fence staples." Silas nodded once and went back to his eggs. He was not the sort of man who speculated about strangers. He figured he would encounter the new schoolteacher sooner or later in the natural course of town business, and that would be that. It happened sooner than he expected, and in a way he had not anticipated. He went into town the following Saturday to pick up a shipment of wire at the hardware, and to settle his account at the dry goods store, and he was coming out of the dry goods with a sack of flour over one shoulder when he nearly walked directly into Ella Merritt, who was coming around the corner from the direction of the post office with her nose in a letter and her attention decidedly elsewhere. He stopped in time. The flour did not fall. But Ella, startled, took a quick step back, and her heel caught the edge of the boardwalk, and she went down, carpetbag swinging, letter flying, and Silas dropped the flour sack against the wall and caught her by the elbow before she hit the planks. It was not a graceful rescue. It was barely a rescue at all. She caught herself mostly on her own, one hand braced against the wall, and she came upright with her hat askew and her cheeks flushed and something between irritation and laughter moving across her face. "I beg your pardon," Silas said, and meant it entirely. "That was my fault. I came around that corner too fast." "It was not your fault," Ella said, straightening her hat with one hand and bending to retrieve the letter with the other. "I was reading while walking, which my father always told me would lead to disaster, and which I have done every day since he said so." She looked up at him as she rose, and he had the unsettling experience of being assessed by a pair of eyes that gave away absolutely nothing except intelligence and a complete lack of pretense. "Ella Merritt," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. "Silas Turner." "You're the rancher," she said. It was not a question. "One of several. Fletcher Goss mentioned you. He said you've been here longer than almost anyone, and that if I ever needed to know something about the land west of town, you would be the person to ask." Silas was not sure whether to be pleased or suspicious of that characterization. "He was generous," he said. "He was useful," Ella said, and picked up her carpetbag. "It was very nice to meet you, Mr. Turner." She gave him one more of those direct, measuring looks, and then she walked away down the street, reading her letter again before she had gone 20 steps. Silas stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then picked up his flour sack and went to get his wire. He thought about her for the rest of the afternoon, and he was annoyed with himself about it, but he thought about her all the same. The thing about small towns in 1878 was that avoiding someone required genuine effort, and Silas was too busy to put genuine effort into avoidance, even if the thought had occurred to him. He saw Ella Merritt again the following Wednesday at the church social that Hazel Boone held every other week in her back garden, which Silas attended because Hazel's husband had been a friend of his, and because Hazel made the best dried apple pie in the county, and he was not above admitting it. Ella was helping set up the tables when he arrived, moving chairs with efficient purpose, talking to Hazel about something that made both of them laugh. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her whole face change. Silas noticed it in the particular way a man notices something that changes the shape of the air around him. He found himself standing near her at the table 3 separate times over the course of the evening, and twice she spoke to him first, asking about cattle prices and about the water situation on the western pastures, questions that suggested she was paying serious attention to the landscape and economics of the place she had chosen to live. She was not making small talk. She was gathering information, quietly and systematically, the way a person does when they intend to stay. He drove home that night in the wagon under a sky absolutely crowded with stars, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that Ella Merritt was the most interesting person he had encountered in 4 years in Caldwell. That thought unsettled him enough that he threw himself into a week of brutal physical labor, which was his customary response to unsettlement. He and Daniel rode the fence lines of the north and west pastures, restrung 3 sections of wire, repaired the gate on the south corral, and spent 2 days cutting timber in the hills for firewood they would not need until autumn. At the end of the week, Silas stood on the east side of his cabin and looked at the structure he had built, solid, weathered, practical, a single room with a good stone fireplace, and a sleeping loft and a porch that faced the valley, and felt for the first time in years how small it was. He did not examine that feeling closely. Or rather, He examined it in the sideways manner of a man who knows what he will find if he looks directly and is not quite ready to look directly. He went to the church the following Sunday. He was not a particularly religious man, but he went sometimes. And Ella was there, sitting 3 rows ahead of him with Hazel Boone, and she had left her hair down under her hat, and it was very long and very dark auburn in the light that came through the tall windows. And Silas looked at the back of her head for the entire length of Reverend Coles's sermon, and retained nothing of the scripture whatsoever. He helped her carry the box of hymnals back to the storage room after the service because he happened to be nearest, and while they were setting the box on the shelf, she said without preamble, "Do you ever get lonely out there? On your property, I mean. It's quite isolated." He looked at her. "Sometimes," he said, because he had learned that honest answers were better than comfortable ones. She nodded as though he had confirmed something she had been considering. "I grew up in a small house," she said. "My father and it was not lonely because we talked a great deal. But I think it is possible to be lonely even with people around, and not lonely even completely alone, depending on the quality of what fills the space." "That's true," Silas said. "I am not lonely here yet," she said. "I think that is a good sign about Caldwell." She picked up her gloves from the shelf where she had set them and looked at him with that same measuring directness. "Will I see you at the Goss dinner on Friday? Fletcher mentioned you might come." "I hadn't decided," Silas said. "It would be nice if you did," she said simply, and put on her gloves and walked out. He went to the Goss dinner. There were 7 people at that dinner, which turned out to be less of a formal occasion, and more of a long, sprawling evening around a large table, with good food and bottles of wine that Fletcher Goss had been saving for a special occasion, and had apparently decided this was it. Silas sat across from Ella, which meant he could talk to her easily, and also, which he was less happy about, that he spent the entire meal acutely conscious of the way the lamplight caught her eyes when she was arguing a point, which she did frequently and with considerable skill, mostly with Dr. Amos Whitfield, about the question of whether the town needed a proper lending library. "A town without books is a town that cannot grow past itself," Ella said, with the patient certainty of someone who had been making this argument for years. "The children I am teaching are bright. Give them access to more ideas and they will become something. Keep them starved of it and they will leave or wither." "We barely have the funds for a proper school building," Whitfield said. He was not being unkind, just practical. "Then we start with a shelf," Ella said. "We start with what we have and we build from there. That is what everyone in this territory has done with everything worth having." Silas thought that was probably the most sensible thing he had heard said in Caldwell since he arrived. He walked her back to Hazel Boone's house after, because it was late and the street was dark, and Fletcher had asked him quietly as they were leaving if he might, as the widow Boone had already gone home earlier in the evening with a headache, and Fletcher was occupied with his own wife and children. It was a 10-minute walk. They took 15. Neither of them seemed to notice, or if they noticed, neither of them mentioned it. They talked about the library project. They talked about the cattle trade and how the arrival of the railway had shifted the whole economy of the southern Kansas plains. They talked about Ohio, which Ella missed in specific ways, the particular green of late summer, the smell of the river, without missing it in general. "Do you miss where you came from?" she asked him. He had told her he was originally from Missouri. "Not particularly," he said. "What I had there is gone. What I have here is mine." He paused. "There's a difference between a place you came from and a place you belong to." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a wise way to think about it," she said, and her voice had something in it he could not quite name. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition. They stopped at Hazel's gate. The sky was brilliant and cold above them, and the coyotes were talking to each other somewhere far out on the plain, and the whole night smelled of wood smoke and new grass. "Thank you for the company," Ella said. "And for the conversation. You are not what I expected, Mr. Turner." "What did you expect?" She smiled, and it was the real one, the one that changed the shape of her face. "I'm not entirely sure. Something quieter." "I am usually quieter," he said. "You seem to draw it out." She looked at him for a moment that stretched just a beat past comfortable, and then she said good night and went inside, and Silas walked back to where he had hitched his horse on the main street and stood there in the dark for a while before mounting up and riding west toward home. He was in serious trouble, and he knew it. The thing about Silas Turner was that he was not a man who did things halfway. He was not built that way, had never been. When he had decided to come to Kansas, he had come. When he had decided to build a cattle operation, he had built one that worked. When he made up his mind about something, it was made up all the way down, bedrock deep, and there was very little in the world capable of shifting it. He had known this about himself for long enough that he had learned to be careful in the making of decisions, because once they were made, they had a way of simply being true. He spent a week thinking about Ella Merritt with the particular uncomfortable concentration of a man trying to talk himself out of something that he has already decided. He replayed their conversations. He thought about the way she argued with Whitfield about books, about the way she said good night at the gate, about the way she moved purposeful, unhurried, as if she knew exactly where she was going and was not interested in arriving before she was ready. He thought about his cabin. He thought about his one room. He rode out on a Wednesday morning in early May when the prairie was very green and the wind was warm, and the light was that particular clear gold that only exists in the mornings of Kansas spring. And he rode the perimeter of his property, which was a thing he did sometimes when he needed to think without interruption. And by the time he had completed the circuit and come back to the cabin, he had made a decision that he recognized as either the bravest or the most foolish thing he had done in his adult life. He had not yet spoken to Ella Merritt about anything more significant than books and cattle and the weather. He had not asked her a single thing about her intentions or her feelings or her future. He had not, in any formal or informal capacity, made any declaration of any kind about what he was thinking or feeling. And yet, he walked around the east side of the cabin to where there was a flat stretch of ground that got good morning sun and afternoon shade, and he stood there for a while looking at the space, and then he went to find Daniel. "I'm going to build another room," he said. Daniel looked at him with the careful expression of a man who has learned to receive information without revealing what he thinks of it. "Onto the cabin," he said. "Yes." How big? Silas thought about it. A proper size, large enough for a real bed and a wardrobe and a chair by the window. He paused. A window on the east wall, one on the south. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "We'll need more timber." "I know. We'll go up to the hills Thursday if the weather holds. It'll take a few weeks at minimum to do it right." "I know that too." Daniel nodded slowly, and if there was something in his expression that suggested he was aware this project had a significance beyond mere home improvement, he kept it behind his teeth, which was one of his finer qualities. "All right," he said. "I'll sharpen the saws." They went up into the hills on Thursday as planned, and by Saturday they had enough timber dragged down to begin. Silas had built the original cabin himself, and he knew what he was doing. He planned it carefully, sketched it out on paper the way his father had taught him, measured twice before he ever swung a hammer. The new room would connect to the east wall of the original cabin through a proper doorway, not just a gap in the logs. It would have a floor of fitted plank rather than the packed earth of the original. It would have a stone foundation along the base to keep the damp out in spring. It would be, in short, a room that was built to last and built to be beautiful, or at least as beautiful as hand-hewn logs and good honest craftsmanship could be. The sound of hammering carried across the valley. That was simply physics. Sound travels in open country. By the following Tuesday, Jim Harker at the feed store had mentioned the construction to 3 separate people. By Wednesday it had reached Fletcher Goss, who stopped Silas on the street with an expression of barely suppressed amusement and said, "Building on, are you?" "I am," Silas said. "Any particular reason?" "A man gets tired of one room," Silas said, and walked on before Fletcher could say anything else. Daniel told him that evening, with the economy of a man who does not waste words, that the whole town was talking. Silas said that he reckoned they were and went back to his measurements. What he had not counted on, and what he probably should have considered with more care, was that the whole town talking included Hazel Boone, who was not a gossip in the mean-spirited sense, but who was a woman who paid attention to things, and who was fond of both Silas Turner and Ella Merritt in the particular way of a person who wants to see the right things happen, and is not above nudging them toward happening. Hazel mentioned the construction to Ella over breakfast on a Thursday morning in a very casual way, describing it as something she had heard from Jim Harker's wife, saying only that Silas Turner was adding a room to his cabin and that it was apparently quite a substantial undertaking. She then busied herself with the coffee pot and said nothing else, because she was a wise woman who knew when to stop. Ella put down her fork. She sat very still for a moment, and a complicated series of things moved across her face, and then she picked up her fork again and continued eating her breakfast. She did not say anything to Hazel about it, but she was quiet for the rest of the morning. The following Saturday was the end of May, and Caldwell was putting on one of its periodic attempts at civic festivity, a spring fair organized by the Methodist Ladies' Aid that occupied the main street with a handful of stalls selling pies and preserves and hand-sewn goods, a horse race down the long straight stretch past the livery, and a communal supper on the square in the evening. Silas came in from the property because Daniel had told him in a tone that left no room for argument that he needed a day off from construction and cattle both. He went to the fair because it was the kind of thing a man showed up to in a town that had given him 4 good years, because he intended to buy one of Hazel Boone's pies, and because Fletcher Goss would sulk for a month if the turnout was poor. He found Ella at the bookstall, which was not a surprise, helping a woman named Clara Marsh arrange a small collection of donated volumes on a folding table with a hand-painted sign that read, "Start of a Library." There were perhaps 30 books, maybe fewer. Ella had arranged them with the same focused energy she brought to everything, spine out, organized by subject. When Silas stopped at the table, she looked up and her face did something complicated that resolved itself into a smile. "The collection is modest," she said. "It's a start," he said, and picked up a volume. It was Dickens. He turned it in his hands. "Who put this together?" "I wrote 12 letters," she said, "to churches in Wichita and in Topeka, and to a book dealer in Kansas City who was very kind. Clara and I collected a few from around town. Fletcher donated $5 from his own pocket when I promised not to tell anyone, so please don't tell anyone." She looked at the table with something that was not quite satisfaction, not quite wistfulness. "It is not a library yet. But it is the idea of one, which is where all libraries have to start." Silas bought 3 books from the table at whatever price Ella suggested and donated them back immediately, which made Clara Marsh laugh and made Ella look at him with an expression that he could not entirely decode, but that sat somewhere in the territory of warmth and surprise. They walked the length of the fair together in the comfortable way of people who have established that they are easy in each other's company, stopping at various stalls, arguing pleasantly about the merits of different pie fillings, watching the horse race from the fence alongside Daniel, who nodded at Ella with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had been watching this situation develop for several weeks. At the supper in the evening, they found themselves at the same end of the long communal table, and the conversation moved from books to the question of what Caldwell needed in the next 5 years to grow into something with real permanence. And Ella talked about the children in her school with a passion and a precision that was clearly the product of genuine love for her work. She knew each of them, their specific strengths and their specific difficulties, what made them curious, what made them afraid. She talked about a boy named Robbie Crane, who was a mathematical prodigy, but who could not see the board clearly from the back of the room, and whose family could not afford spectacles. And Silas filed that information away in the back of his mind where useful things went. The lanterns came on as the sun went down, and the square took on a warm, golden light, and someone brought out a fiddle, and then another fiddle, and the supper began to drift sideways into something more festive. Silas was not a dancer, on the grounds that he had never learned properly, and had decided at some point that the embarrassment of learning as an adult outweighed the potential rewards. But he sat with his coffee and watched the couples on the makeshift dance floor in the square and felt something very large and very specific sitting in his chest. Ella sat beside him. She was watching the dancing too. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Badly," he said. "I could teach you." He looked at her. "Right now." "Not right now," she said. "But someday, if you like." She said it easily, lightly, the way you can say something that means a great deal and have it land gently because of the way you carry it. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard there's a new room being built onto a cabin west of town." She was very still beside him for just a beat. "I heard that too," she said, carefully neutral, her eyes still on the dancers. "Might be that the man building it had a reason," Silas said. His voice was steady. He had thought about this moment for 3 weeks, and he had decided that when it came he was going to be honest, because anything else would be cowardly, and he was not a coward. Might be that he had a specific reason, the kind that requires a conversation he hasn't had yet. Ella turned and looked at him. Her eyes in the lamplight were very dark and very clear, and she was not hiding a single thing behind them, which was its own kind of answer. "That seems like a significant thing to build before having the conversation," she said. "It is," he said. "It probably was not the most rational sequence of events." "No," she agreed. "But I wanted you to know," he said, "that the room will be finished regardless. It will be a good room. And I believe, Ella, that you would be the only person I would ever build it for." The fiddles were playing something slow and sweet, and the night smelled of spring and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of apple pie, and the square was full of the warm sound of people who were happy in each other's company. Ella Merritt looked at Silas Turner for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you are one of the most unusual men I have ever met." "Is that an answer?" he asked. "It is the beginning of one," she said. "I would like to see the room when it is finished." He felt something release in his chest, something he had not known he was holding. "I would like that very much," he said. She turned back to the dancers, and after a moment her hand, which was resting on the table between them, shifted a half-inch to the right, and her little finger rested against his. Neither of them said anything about it. They sat there for the rest of the evening with that small point of contact between them, and the fiddles played and the lanterns burned, and the night was warm and full of stars. And it was, Silas thought, about as close to perfect as anything he had experienced in his 31 years. The following weeks had a quality that Silas could not quite describe to himself, a texture of anticipation, of things becoming possible that had only been theoretical before. He went into town twice a week now instead of once, and he told himself it was because he needed supplies for the construction, and that was not entirely untrue. Ella came out to the property on a Sunday afternoon in early June, brought in Hazel Boone's wagon along with Hazel herself and Daniel, who had been roped in as a chaperone of sorts by Hazel's gentle insistence that things should be done properly. A sentiment that both Silas and Ella accepted without argument, because Hazel was right and they both knew it. Ella walked around the half-finished room with her hands clasped behind her back and her expression very focused, and Silas watched her and tried not to read too much into the way she stood at the east window opening and looked out at the view, the long slope of the valley, the silver line of the creek at the bottom, the hills beyond purple in the afternoon light, and was quiet for a long time. "It's beautiful," she said. "Not about the room. About the view." "Yes," he said, and he was not looking at the view. She turned and caught him looking, and for a moment neither of them moved. And then Hazel called from the porch that she had brought lemonade, and that was the end of that particular moment. But it was a moment that stayed with both of them. Over the following weeks, something developed between them that had the quality of a conversation that had been going on for a very long time, that simply continued each time they were together, picking up threads and adding to them, and leaving certain things deliberately unfinished, because there was pleasure in the returning to them. He visited her at the school one afternoon when the children had gone home and found her erasing the board, chalk dust on her sleeves, a book open on her desk. She showed him the children's compositions she had set them writing about what they saw from their windows, what they wanted to learn, what they were afraid of, and her voice as she read them aloud had a tenderness in it that struck him somewhere deep. He mentioned the boy Robbie Crane, the one who could not see the board. "I know," she said, and her face tightened slightly with the particular frustration of a person who sees a solvable problem they lack the means to solve. "I wrote to a spectacle maker in Kansas City," Silas said. He kept his voice matter-of-fact, the way he always did with things that mattered. "There's a traveling medical man who comes through Wichita twice a year. I can arrange for Robbie and his mother to have their fare covered on the stage, and the spectacle maker has agreed to bill me directly." Ella stared at him. "Silas, it's not a great expense," he said. "That is not the point," she said. Her voice had something in it he needed a moment to identify, and then he recognized it as the sound of a person who has been given exactly what they needed by someone who noticed they needed it without being told. She reached across the desk and put her hand over his for just a second. "Thank you," she said. "That is genuinely one of the kindest things I have seen done." "You care about those children," he said. "Someone ought to help." She looked at him steadily. "You are making it very difficult," she said, "to maintain any reasonable degree of caution about you." "Good," he said, and meant it. The summer came on hot and bright and Caldwell baked under the Kansas sky. But the afternoons at the property were reliably cooled by the breeze that came down the valley, and Ella began to come out on Sundays regularly, sometimes with Hazel, sometimes with a group from town that would descend on Silas's porch with food and loud conversation, and sometimes, after the first month of regular visits had established something like a tacit understanding, alone. Or as close to alone as two people could be in a frontier settlement where everyone watched everything and had opinions about it. She helped him choose where to put the window boxes on the new room's east wall, which felt like a significant decision, more significant than window boxes had any right to be. They argued about it for 20 minutes with a cheerful thoroughness that ended with them agreeing on her suggestion, which he had independently arrived at before the argument began, but had not conceded immediately because arguing with her was one of the great pleasures of his life, and he was not ready to give it up. He kissed her for the first time in the middle of an argument about the window boxes, which was not exactly planned. She had been pointing at the wall, and he had been looking at where she was pointing, and she had turned to say something, and he had been closer than either of them had realized, and there was a moment of absolute stillness in which neither of them moved, and then he kissed her, briefly, carefully, the way a man kisses a woman when he has been wanting to for weeks and is finally certain that wanting is the right word for what he feels. She was very still when he drew back. Then she said, "That was a yes in case you were wondering." He looked at her. "A yes to what?" "To the question you asked at the spring fair," she said, "about the room and what it meant. And the conversation you said hadn't happened yet." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, very gently, and felt the whole of the Kansas summer settle around them like something resolved. "I haven't asked you anything formally yet," he said. "I know," she said. "I am allowing you the dignity of asking properly when you are ready." He laughed then, a full laugh, unexpected, and she laughed too, and it echoed off the unfinished walls of the new room, and it sounded, Silas thought, like the right sound for that space to hold. He asked her properly 2 weeks later, on a Sunday evening when the room was finished. The room was everything he had planned it to be. The floor was fitted plank, sanded smooth and stained a warm amber. The east and south windows were in, and they had made window boxes that were not yet planted, but that sat waiting with the patience of things that know their purpose. The stone foundation was solid, and the walls were straight, and the doorway connecting to the original cabin was framed with timber he had hand-planed until it was perfect. He had built a proper bed frame of oak, simple and strong, and made a frame for a mirror that Fletcher Goss had helped him acquire from a trader in Wichita. There was a chair by the east window, a good chair with arms. He had put a single wildflower bouquet on the windowsill, wrapped in a piece of cloth, because it was June and the prairie was full of wildflowers, and it seemed like the right thing to do, and he was trying very hard to do everything right. Ella stood in the middle of the room in the late evening light and looked at all of it, turning slowly, taking it in. Her hands were clasped in front of her. He could see the expression on her face clearly. It was not a complicated expression. It was a very simple one. She was moved, purely and completely moved, by this room that had been built for her before she had been asked. "Silas," she said quietly. "Ella Merritt," he said. He had practiced this. He had actually written it down and then burned the paper because the idea of being the kind of man who practiced speeches was too much to bear. But he had practiced it nonetheless, and now that the moment was here, the words came cleanly. "I built this room because I could not imagine this property without you in it. And I knew that before I had any right to know it, and I apologize for the presumption. But I would like very much, with all the honesty I have, to ask you now, will you come? Will you stay? Will you be my wife?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a nighthawk called over the valley in its thin, carrying cry, and the evening wind moved through the grass, and the last of the daylight lay gold and long across the new floor. "Yes," Ella said. Her voice was very steady and very certain. "Yes, Silas, I will." He crossed the room to her in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he held her in the new room that he had built for her. And the window boxes waited on the sills, and the evening deepened around the cabin, and neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed saying. They were married in September of 1878 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a morning when the first chill of autumn was in the air, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow. Reverend Coles performed the ceremony, and the church was as full as it had been for any occasion in the town's brief history, because Caldwell was small enough that an event of genuine happiness was everyone's event, and because both Silas and Ella had, in their quiet and specific ways, made themselves known and valued in the community, and people wanted to witness the thing that had been witnessed in progress all summer. Ella wore a dress she had made herself of dark blue wool, practical and beautiful in the way she herself was practical and beautiful, and she carried a small bunch of late prairie asters because she had said she did not need anything more elaborate, and she had meant it. Hazel Boone wept behind a lace handkerchief in the front pew with the contented tears of a woman who has seen the right thing happen. Daniel Crow stood at the edge of the room near the door, clean-shaved and in his good coat, and when Reverend Coles pronounced them man and wife and Silas kissed his bride, Daniel put his fingers in his mouth and whistled, which produced a sound like a train departing and which made Ella laugh into the kiss. Fletcher Goss threw a dinner at his house for the whole town that evening, and there was a real fiddle player and a guitarist from over near Medicine Lodge, and the dancing went on until midnight. And Silas danced with his wife at every turn, because he had decided in early July that the embarrassment of learning was worth it, and he had asked Daniel to teach him. And Daniel had done so with the patient amusement of someone who understood exactly why the lesson was needed and chose to say nothing about it. He was not a good dancer, but he was adequate, and Ella was a good enough dancer for both of them, and what he lacked in skill he made up for in a kind of devoted attention to her that she found, she told him later, extremely disarming. They drove home that night in the wagon under a sky that had gone vast and cold and October brilliant with stars, Ella sitting close to him on the bench with his arm around her shoulders, and the horse knowing the road well enough to need very little guidance. She had moved her things into the new room the week before the wedding, because they had decided to spend their first night in the cabin as husband and wife, and coming home to it now, the lamplight in the window that Daniel had left burning for them, the familiar smell of wood and grass and the faint cold scent of the coming season, had a quality that Silas could not name, but that felt like the word home, said by someone who understood all the weight it carried. He carried her across the threshold because it seemed important, and because she laughed when he picked her up and said in a tone of great dignity that she was perfectly capable of walking, which he acknowledged fully while carrying her through the door anyway. The winter that came was a hard one. January of 1879 brought storms off the plains that lasted days at a time, piling snow against the cabin walls and keeping even the stock close. This was not the worst Silas had known in Kansas, but it was significant, and they spent those weeks in the particular intimacy of two people sealed inside a small space by weather, which has a way of either revealing incompatibility or confirming its opposite. It confirmed its opposite with a thoroughness that left both of them quietly astonished by their luck. They talked. They talked for hours, days, across every subject they had not yet gotten to in the months before, and Ella read aloud to him from the books on the shelf by the fireplace. She had brought a good collection, her father's books and her own, and he found that he loved being read to in a way he had not expected, not the passive reception of it, but the quality of her voice moving through language, the way she inhabited the words as she read them. He fixed things around the cabin during those weeks, and she sat at the table and planned the curriculum for the spring term, and sometimes they worked in companionable silence for hours, and sometimes they broke into conversation mid-thought, the way people do when they have become so comfortable in each other's company that the line between thinking and speaking has blurred. He told her things he had not told anyone. About Missouri, about his father, about the years before Kansas when he had been a different kind of man, harder and more solitary, and less able to imagine that anything was coming that would be worth the waiting. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which was to say total and unperforming, and she told him things in return about her father's illness, the slow impoverishment of their last years together, the pride she had carried about it that had made those years lonelier than they needed to be. "I should have asked for help," she said one evening, and there was a flatness in her voice that told him she had made peace with this but had not forgotten it. "I was so determined to be capable that I forgot that asking for help can also be a kind of capability. You came here," he said. "That was a considerable act of asking." She looked at him across the firelight. "I came here for a job," she said. "You came here because you knew there was something here that was possible," he said. "That's not small." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always find the version of the story that makes the person the bravest. That's a gift." "Only when it's true," he said. In February she told him she was with child. He sat very still when she said it, the coffee tin in his hand going forgotten. And then he set it down carefully and looked at her across the table with an expression that she would later describe to Hazel Boone as the most completely open face she had ever seen on a grown man. Wide open, nothing behind it but unguarded feeling. "Ella," he said. "Yes," she said, watching him. "Are you well?" "I am extremely well," she said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her for a long time, his face in her hair, the winter pressing at the window and the fire warm at their backs, and he felt something so large move through him that he could not have named it if he tried, not joy exactly, though it was joy, but something that contained joy and exceeded it, something closer to the experience of understanding, for the first time, the full dimensions of your own life. The spring of 1879 was different from every spring before it. Ella continued teaching through March and into April, until the size of her pregnancy made the walk into town impractical, and then she taught from the cabin for the last month, with 3 of the older students riding out twice a week to collect and return work, which they did with the earnest reliability of children who understood that something important was being entrusted to them. Robbie Crane, the boy with the bad eyes, came on those days with his spectacles which had arrived in March from Kansas City, a small miracle of wire and glass that had made him cry when he put them on, and saw the board clearly for the first time in years. Ella had not told him where the spectacles had come from, only that an arrangement had been made, and Silas had been very firm about it remaining that way. But Robbie's mother, Mary Crane, had come to the cabin on a Saturday in early spring with a jar of preserves and a handshake for Silas that was stronger than many men's, and had said only, "He told me what you did, Mr. Turner. He wanted you to know," and that had been enough. Their son was born in June of 1879, on a warm evening when the lightning bugs were just beginning to come out over the valley, in the new room that had been built for his mother before she had been asked. Hazel Boone was there and the doctor, and Daniel waited on the porch. Silas sat with Ella through all of it, which was not the universal practice of the time, and which he refused to be moved from on the grounds that she was not going through anything difficult alone while he was present. And Ella, between the harder moments, held his hand hard enough to leave marks that lasted 3 days. The boy was healthy and loud, and had Ella's auburn tinge in the fine hair and Silas's river slate eyes, and Ella looked down at him in the lamplight of the room she had come to think of as the most beautiful room she had ever inhabited, and felt the full weight of all the particular chain of events that had led to this moment. Silas looked at his son, and then at his wife, and his face did the thing again, that complete openness, and Ella, even exhausted, even spent, felt herself smile at him, at the whole magnificent improbability of the life they had built together. They named him James after Ella's father. James Turner grew in the way of healthy babies, fast and loud and demanding and enchanting. And the cabin that had been 1 room when Silas first built it, and then 2 rooms when he had built the second for Ella, was now 2 rooms and a porch, and a second sleeping loft added in the autumn of 1879, which Silas built with Daniel's help in 2 weeks of concentrated labor, while Ella sat in the doorway with James on her lap, and kept him company, and offered opinions on load-bearing calculations that were occasionally correct in ways that made Silas set down his hammer and look at her with a mixture of respect and suspicion. "Where did you learn about load-bearing walls?" he asked her. "I read a great deal," she said serenely, and bounced James on her knee. The library had grown. By the end of 1879 it had outgrown the table at the spring fair and moved into a corner of the school building, and by the spring of 1880 it occupied a full wall and had a proper catalog that Ella had made, organized by subject in her meticulous hand, and a lending system on the honor principle that had, so far, honored itself without a single exception. Dr. Whitfield had come around on the subject entirely and had donated 20 medical texts, which Ella accepted graciously and shelved under natural philosophy. The town was growing. The railway had brought more settlers, more commerce, more of everything, more people with more needs and more complications. Caldwell was on the edge of the cattle trade's rougher aspects, and there were seasons when the drovers came through from Texas with money in their pockets, and the town's saloons became genuinely dangerous after dark. Silas had never been a violent man, but he was not a passive one, and there were 2 occasions in 1880 when he involved himself in situations on the main street that required a firm physical presence and a willingness to put himself between trouble and people who could not protect themselves. He never talked about those occasions in any detail, and Ella did not press him, but she noticed his hands the morning after the second one scraped knuckles, a bruise along his cheekbone, and brought him a basin of warm water and sat with him at the table and did not say a word, only looked at him steadily with the kind of look that means I know what you are and I am not frightened of it. He thought, at moments like those, that being known was the strangest and most sustaining gift one person could give another. Daniel Crow, in the summer of 1880, came to Silas with a request that was out of character for a man who prided himself on not needing much. He asked for a couple of days off from the property work. He did not explain immediately, and Silas did not ask, only said of course and told him to take whatever he needed. Daniel took 3 days and came back different in a specific way that Silas recognized, a particular shift in bearing that he had felt in himself in the spring of 1878. "There's a woman," Daniel said, which was not a question and not quite a confession, more like a fact being stated for the official record. "There is," Silas agreed, without asking anything further, because some things a man earns the right to say in his own time. Her name was Margaret, and she was the daughter of a farmer who had come out from Missouri the previous year and had taken a claim 20 miles south of Caldwell. She was 22 years old, and she was, as Ella told Silas when she first met her, one of the smartest and most quietly determined people she had encountered since her own mirror, which made Silas laugh until she told him she was serious, which she was. Margaret had a capability that was immediately apparent and a sense of humor that was slower to surface but was, when it came, devastating. Daniel and Margaret were married in the winter of 1880 in a small ceremony at the farm, and Silas and Ella attended and brought James, who was 18 months old and extremely interested in everything and very vocal about that interest, and had to be taken outside twice during the vows by his father, which meant that Silas missed the moment of the kiss, which he felt was somewhat ironic given that Daniel had witnessed his own vows with perfect composure. Life on the property in those years had a rhythm that Silas had never experienced before, and that he sometimes stopped to marvel at, not sentimentally, but with a quiet, considered gratitude for the specifics of it. The mornings when Ella was at the table with her marking and James was playing in the dirt of the yard, and the light was coming long across the valley. The evenings when they sat on the porch after James was asleep and talked, or did not talk, with the prairie spreading out below them in the blue dusk. The particular Sunday morning quality of that second room in winter, with the lamp burning and the smell of coffee coming through the door from the original cabin, and Ella still asleep in the oak bed he had built, the quilt pulled up and one hand open on the pillow. He had been right about the view from the east window. It was the best view on the property, and she had agreed with him about it in the end, which she did about most things, though not quickly, and not without having made him earn the agreement through actual conversation rather than assumption. In the spring of 1881, two things happened in short succession. The first was that James Turner learned to walk properly, graduating from the lurching, crash-prone ambulation of his early attempts to a genuine independent forward motion that took him in 3 days from the porch steps to the corral gate, which he then attempted to open, and which was the beginning of a prolonged campaign by James Turner to get to the horses that would occupy much of his second and third years. The second was that Ella discovered she was expecting again. This time she told him differently, not across the breakfast table but in the evening on the porch, after James was in bed, with the sky going dark above the valley and the first stars coming through. She simply said, "Silas," in that particular way she had when she was about to say something important, and when he looked at her she was already looking at him, and he read it in her face before she said the words. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. He took her hand on the porch rail and they sat together in the growing dark and did not need to say anything more about it than that for a long while. Their daughter was born in December of 1881, in the new room, in a snowstorm that kept Hazel Boone from reaching the property in time, which meant that it was Silas who was with Ella through the whole of it, without the mediation of any other person, and that was a thing that bound them to each other in a way that had no exact equivalent. He was terrified and calm in the way that love makes you terrified and calm simultaneously, and Ella was extraordinarily fierce and focused, and at the end, laughing with the exhausted, incredulous laughter of someone who has done something they are not sure they believe they could do. The girl had Silas's dark hair and Ella's green eyes, and a face that, in those first hours, was rugged and perfect and already somehow utterly itself. They named her Frances, for no one in particular and for itself, because it was a name Ella had always loved the sound of, and Silas thought she was right. James Turner, aged 2.5, was brought in to meet his sister the following morning and stood at the bedside with a gravity that was slightly undermined by the fact that he was wearing his boots on the wrong feet, looked at Francis for a long time, and then looked at his parents and said, with the certainty of a person who has made a serious decision, "Mine." "Yours," Ella confirmed, and James nodded with great satisfaction and immediately tried to pick Francis up, which Silas intercepted with the reflexes of a man who had been parenting a determined small person for 2.5 years. By the spring of 1882, the cabin had expanded again. There was now a proper kitchen lean-to on the north side, with a real iron stove that Silas had spent what he later described as an unacceptable amount of money on, and which Ella used with a capability that suggested the stove had gotten the better end of the transaction. There was a vegetable garden behind the kitchen that Ella and Daniel's wife Margaret had planted together, and which produced, in its first full summer, more tomatoes than the two families could eat, and which they sold at the Caldwell market with a neatly handwritten sign in Ella's schoolteacher's script, the proceeds going, of course, to the library. The library, by 1882, had outgrown the school building. This was a problem that Ella addressed with the same systematic determination she brought to every problem, which was to say she wrote letters and attended meetings and was quietly relentless until Fletcher Goss, who by this point had learned that relentlessness in Ella Merritt was a force of nature you worked with rather than against, committed town funds to a small dedicated building on the corner of Main and 2nd. It was not a large building, but it had good shelves that Silas built over 2 weekends in April, and a proper door, and a window that got the morning light. And when it opened in May of 1882, it had 412 volumes, catalogued in Ella's hand, and it was the finest lending library between Wichita and the Indian Territory. And Ella stood in the doorway on opening morning with Francis on her hip and James pulling at her other hand, and looked at what had begun as 30 books on a table at a church fair and felt, with a completeness that was almost frightening in its contentment, that she had done what she had come to do. She had planted a thing. It was growing. Silas stood behind her in the doorway with his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him just slightly, and they looked at the library together, and Robbie Crane, who was 12 now and nearly the height of a man and who still wore his spectacles and who was, in Ella's professional estimation, going to be an engineer or a mathematician or possibly both, was already inside, seated at the reading table with 2 books open before him. And that was, Ella thought, exactly the right image for an opening day. There was a moment in the summer of 1882 that lived in Silas Turner's memory with a particular clarity, one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening, and only reveals its significance in retrospect. He was on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles that the winter had lifted, and he could see across the whole of the property from up there, the valley, the creek, the hills, the garden, the cabin with its accumulated additions that made it look now like something that had grown rather than been built. He could see Ella in the garden with Francis, who was 8 months old and sitting in the dirt with perfect contentment, and James was at the corral fence looking at the horses, and Daniel was coming up from the south pasture on horseback, and everything was in its right place, and the sky was that particular deep blue of a Kansas summer noon, and the wind moved through the long grass of the valley below in waves, and Silas sat on the roof of his barn and understood, with a simple and total clarity, that his life had become exactly what he had not known how to hope for. He had built a room for a woman he had not yet asked. She had come. And the asking, when it finally happened, had been less a question than a confirmation of something that had already decided itself in the space between them, in every conversation and every evening on the porch, and every argument about window boxes, and every silence that was filled with the particular quality of belonging that is the truest name for love. He climbed down from the barn roof when he had finished the last shingle and walked across the yard to where Ella was crouching beside Francis in the garden, pulling a weed from between the tomato plants, and he stood over her for a moment, and she looked up at him with a strand of hair across her face from the wind and Francis reaching for his boot. "What?" she said, because she always knew when he was holding something. "Nothing," he said. "Only looking." She studied him for a moment with those direct green eyes. "You are an extremely strange man," she said, not unkindly. He picked Francis up out of the dirt and she grabbed his collar with both small fists, and his daughter smelled of earth and warm cotton and something impossibly new, and Ella stood up beside him and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "Extremely strange," she said again, "and I am very glad of you." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I know," he said. "I am glad of you too." James came running from the corral at a full sprint in the way of a 3-year-old who has only one speed, calling something about the horse, and the afternoon opened up around them, and the summer continued its long, burning descent, and life went on in all its specific, irreplaceable particularity. The years that followed were years of growth and change in ways both expected and not. Caldwell continued to change around them. The cattle trade shifted. The rough season of the great Texas drives began to wind down as more of the open range was fenced and farmed, and the character of the town matured, as all frontier towns do, from something provisional and volatile into something with the beginnings of genuine permanence. New families came. The school grew. The library added a second shelf unit, and then a third. Silas's cattle operation expanded cautiously and successfully, and he and Daniel talked about taking on a third section of land to the north, which they eventually did in the spring of 1884. The injustices of the time pressed on them in various ways that they could not ignore. Daniel and Margaret encountered, on several occasions, a hostility in town that had everything to do with who Daniel was and nothing to do with who he had shown himself to be. And this enraged Ella with a cold, specific fury that she directed, where she could, into action, speaking plainly in town meetings, making certain that Daniel's children, when they came, were welcomed in her school without any qualification, and writing 2 letters to the Caldwell newspaper that caused enough discussion to be useful and enough discomfort to be honest. Silas backed her in this with the quiet and immovable solidarity of a man who had decided what he stood for. And while they could not fix everything that was wrong with the world they inhabited, they could make the particular piece of it that they occupied decent, and they did. In 1884, Ella became pregnant for the 3rd time, and this pregnancy was harder than the others. The summer was oppressive and she tired more easily, and there were weeks when she was not fully herself. And Silas managed the household and the children and the property with a focused competence that impressed everyone who saw it, and that he simply considered the natural condition of marriage, which was that when one person needed the other was there. Their 2nd son was born in November of 1884, healthy and screaming, with a full head of dark hair, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as considerably more dramatic than either James's pragmatic calm or Francis's sweet equanimity. They named him Thomas. James Turner, at 5 years old, received his new brother with the measured assessment of an eldest child who has been managing a sibling for 3 years and is not naive about what this addition entails. He looked at Thomas in Ella's arms and said, "He is very loud," in a tone that suggested this was a data point being filed rather than a complaint. "He is," Ella agreed. "He will get better," James said, with the magnanimity of a person who has been loud himself and recovered from it. Frances, aged 2, was enchanted. She sat beside Ella on the bed and watched Thomas with an expression of complete absorption and tried, at the first opportunity, to give him a carved wooden horse that had been her primary comfort object for the past year and a half, which Silas gently redirected while Ella hid a smile. By the time Thomas was a year old, James could ride a horse without supervision. He did this with the careful, serious attention he brought to everything physical, studying it as he studied his numbers in school, methodically and without flash. And Silas watched him on horseback and felt, in a way that was not overwhelming but simply deep, the satisfaction of seeing a child inhabit the landscape that had been chosen for him. The evening school that Ella had begun in 1883 for the adults of Caldwell who had not had the opportunity to learn to read continued to run on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the library building. And it was at this school that Mary Crane learned to read well enough to write a letter. And she wrote that letter to her sister in Missouri, and her sister came to Caldwell in the summer of 1884 and ended up staying, which was a small thread in the larger fabric of what a library and a school, and one teacher's refusal to accept that education was only for the young could do in a small town on the Kansas plain. In the winter of 1885, Silas finished a project that he had been working on in pieces for 2 years, a proper desk for Ella, made of oak, built into the corner of the original cabin near the south window where the light was best. He had made the drawers to fit her specific needs as she had described them without knowing he was listening that carefully, a wide, shallow one for paper, a narrower one with a fitted insert for pens and chalk, a deep one for her books in progress. He finished it while she was at the school one December afternoon, and he had James help him move the old table out, and the desk in while Francis sat on the floor eating an apple with profound concentration, and Thomas, 14 months, pulled himself around the legs of the furniture with investigative enthusiasm. When Ella came home and walked through the door and saw the desk in the corner and stopped, Silas was watching from the kitchen doorway with his shoulder against the frame and his arms folded, and her hand went to her mouth for a moment, just briefly, in the gesture of someone caught off guard by something beautiful. She turned and looked at him across the room, and he thought her face in that moment was the same as it had been in the new room in June of 1878, when she had stood in the last light and said the word yes with a completeness that he still felt, 7 years later, like something warm along the sternum. "Silas Turner," she said. "It should have been built years ago," he said. "You've been making do with the table." "I have been perfectly fine with the table," she said, still looking at him. "You deserve a desk that fits your work," he said. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked up at him, and then she kissed him with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knows her own mind entirely, and James said, from somewhere behind them in the way of a 7-year-old who has formed a view about adult affection, and Francis laughed at James's and Thomas made a sound that was either approval or surprise and was probably both. "Thank you," Ella said against his cheek. "It is perfect." "You are perfect," he said. "I am frequently difficult and occasionally unreasonable," she said. "Which is what I said," he told her. She laughed, and the sound of it filled the cabin the way it had filled the new room that first time, completely and rightly. In the spring of 1887, Robbie Crane left Caldwell for Topeka to attend the state college on a scholarship that Dr. Whitfield and Ella together had written the application for. And the morning he left he came to the cabin to say goodbye to Ella, who had been his teacher for 8 years, and who had changed the direction of his life in ways that had begun with a letter to a spectacle maker in Kansas City, and a man who had thought to write it. Robbie shook Silas's hand at the door and said, in the serious way he had that always made him seem older than his age, "I know it was you, Mr. Turner. Ma told me a long time ago. I wanted you to know I know." Silas looked at him for a moment. "I wanted you to see the board," he said. "That's all it was." "It was more than that," Robbie said. And then he picked up his bag and walked down the track to where the wagon was waiting to take him into town for the stage. And Ella stood on the porch and watched him go with her hand over her eyes against the morning sun, and something that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but was entirely composed of both. "He is going to do extraordinary things," she said. "I know it," Silas said beside her. She took his hand. They watched the wagon go until it crested the hill and disappeared, and then they went back inside where Thomas was attempting to teach Francis a card game, and James was at the table doing his arithmetic with a furrow between his brows that was precisely his father's thinking face, and the morning continued. The summer of 1888 was hot and dry in the way that Kansas summers can be when the rain fails, and the creek in the valley ran low, and the grass went brown earlier than usual, and Silas spent 2 weeks of July hauling water to the stock in a process that was exhausting and necessary, and that he carried out without complaint, with Daniel alongside him. The two of them in those long, dusty days with very little to say because there was nothing to say. You simply did what needed doing. Ella brought water out to them in the afternoons, she and Francis in the wagon, with a covered jug of cold well water and sometimes bread and cold meat for the midday. She never made the trip seem like anything other than practical, but she always stayed a quarter of an hour, and she and Silas would sit on the wagon board in the spare shade while Daniel and Francis talked. Francis was 6 by then, entirely fearless, with a gift for drawing animals that she exercised constantly in any medium available to her, and those quarter hours in the hard summer had a quality of necessary sustenance that was about more than the water. "Are we going to be all right?" Ella asked one of those afternoons, not anxiously but directly, in the way she asked everything. "We'll lose some of the summer growth," he said. "We'll have to sell a few earlier than I'd like. But we're all right." He paused. "The east pasture held up better than I expected, and the well is deep." "Good," she said. And she handed him another piece of bread, and looked at the low brown hills and the bleached sky with the steady gaze of a woman who had decided long ago that difficulty was simply a condition to be managed and not a signal to despair. And he thought, not for the first time, that she was the most grounded person he had ever known, grounded in the true sense, connected to the real, capable of standing on it without flinching. The summer ended, and the rains came in August, and the grass came back, and the creek rose, and the autumn was rich and clear, and the harvest, though below average, was enough. They came through it as they had come through the hard winter of 1879, and every other difficulty before and since together, without drama, without the luxury of falling apart, and with a particular quality of partnership that was the most practical and most profound love Silas had ever known or expected to know. In November of 1888, on the eve of their 10th wedding anniversary, Ella sat at her oak desk by the south window in the lamplight and wrote, not a letter and not curriculum, but something for herself, a record, she called it, though it was more than that. She wrote about arriving at the Caldwell stage stop in April of 1878 with her 2 bags and her trunk, and the specific quality of the air on that first day. She wrote about Hazel Boone and Fletcher Goss and the spring fair and the table of 30 books. She wrote about a man she had nearly walked into on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, and the way he had apologized as though he meant it, and the particular color of his eyes. She wrote about coming to the property for the first time, the new room half finished, the window openings looking out over the valley. She wrote about what it had meant to her, not the presumption of it, which she had never minded the way people might have expected, but the meaning of it. A man who knew his own mind. A man who had decided to be honest with himself, and then to be honest with the world about what he had decided, before there was any certainty that the decision would be welcomed. She had thought about that for a long time, about the courage in it, about the trust it represented, not trust in her particularly, since he had barely known her, but trust in his own capacity to feel something true and act on it without the protection of prior assurance. She wrote, "He built a second room before he had even asked me if I would come. I have thought about that every year of the 10 years we have been married, and I have never thought of it the same way twice. Sometimes it is the most reckless thing I have ever heard of. Sometimes it is the most faithful. I think this year it is both. I think the recklessness and the faithfulness are the same thing, and that is the closest I have gotten to understanding what it is he gave me, before he knew he was giving it, in the space of a half-finished room and a view of the valley that I have been looking out at every morning since." She put down her pen. From the sleeping loft above, she could hear Thomas, who still slept restlessly, turning in his bunk. From James's side of the loft, there was the regular deep silence of a child who sleeps as he does everything else, completely. Frances's room, the small addition they had made off the new room for when she was old enough to want her own space, was quiet. She heard Silas come up the porch steps in the particular rhythm of his step that she knew better than her own heartbeat, heard him push the door open quietly and pull off his boots in the way of a man who has come home to a sleeping household many times and knows exactly how to exist in it without waking it. She was still at her desk when he came through the door and saw the lamp. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still up," he said. "I was writing," she said. He came to the desk and looked at the pages, not reading them. He would not read her private writing without invitation, but seeing them, the density of her script across the page, and then he looked at her face. "What were you writing about?" he asked. "You," she said. "And the room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the other chair up beside the desk the way he had done 1,000 times, the way that was as habitual and as deliberate as breathing, and sat down. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it with the same honest simplicity with which he asked everything that mattered, without the protection of irony or deflection, because that was the kind of man he was. She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had built her a room before he knew her, who had written to a spectacle maker for a boy he had never met, who had held her hand through 3 births and 2 hard winters and 1 dry summer and every ordinary extraordinary day between, who had built her a desk because he had been paying attention, who sat beside her now in the lamplight on the eve of their 10th year as though there was nowhere else in the world he could be, and nothing he would rather be doing. "I am so happy," she said, and the word happy was entirely too small for what she meant, and she knew it and said it anyway, because some truths require the small words that everybody knows. He reached across and took her hand on the desktop. His hand was the same width and callous and warmth, and her hand in it was the same as it had been that first time he had held it, in the moment before she said yes, in the room he had built before he asked. "Good," he said. "So am I." They sat together in the quiet of the cabin while the November night pressed cold and vast against the windows, while their children slept above them in the dark, while the valley lay still and silver under the stars outside, while all the years they had built lay around them in every solid and beautiful thing. The oak desk, the fitted floor, the planted window boxes, the library shelf in the corner, the porch that faced the valley. The room that had been built first and asked about second, and lived in third and loved completely ever after. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold weeks ago, and the leaves were mostly down now, and come spring they would come back, as they always did, and the grass would green up, and the horses would move to the south pasture, and James would ride out early in the mornings, the way he had been doing since he was 7, and Frances would fill every available surface with drawings, and Thomas would argue about something with the full-throated energy that was his particular gift. And Silas and Ella would sit on the porch in the evening and watch the light change on the valley as they had always done, as they intended to do for the rest of their living days. Outside the window of the room that had been built before it was asked for, the stars over Caldwell, Kansas, were thick and cold and permanent, and the prairie lay dark and enormous under them, and the cabin glowed with its single light, and Ella Merritt Turner turned the last page of what she had written and set it aside, and held her husband's hand on the desktop, and the night was wide and full and theirs.